someone working through healing and recovery from childhood sexual abuse, that recovery process is, well, a process. In all that I've read, the fellow survivors I've met with, and in my own recovery work, I've found that this is not an instant fix, rather a progressive journey. In just a moment, I'll start showing you what that recovery process can look like. Hi, my name is Bruce. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse and I'm a Christian. You may not hear those two statements together all that often, especially from a male, and probably that's even rarer in church life, of which I've been in senior leadership roles for a couple of decades. So these messages are about bringing awareness, healing, and recovery to all victims of sexual abuse, but especially males. It's about going from victim to survivor to thriver. But before we get into this content, I need to advise you of my disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, but what I intend to share is what has helped me over the years. Like myself, you need to determine what you feel is helpful and suitable for you. So this series of messages is about recovery. There's a lot that I want to share with you, so when you are ready, you can move on from one message to the next. In case you're seeing this message first, I suggest you also check out the messages on awareness, because that's a really big process and that's the starting place for anyone's recovery from childhood sexual abuse. Recovery is not a standalone process. It requires a level of awareness. However, you will never be fully aware of the impacts of childhood sexual abuse without also working through recovery steps. The two are interconnected. You will probably find certain recovery milestones bring further awareness, and that awareness can then lead you on to another step in recovery. As I've mentioned in other messages, it's a bit like peeling back the layers of an onion, the layers that seem to just keep coming. Now, we won't cover all of these aspects of recovery in this one message, but let me step out for you the main points I will cover in these recovery series. They are guilt, betrayal, suppressed emotions and feelings, relating to others, trust, acting out, recovery elements, personal impact, the recovery process, triggers, gender-specific dynamics, self-harm, support strategies. Quite possibly in hearing that list, you could think to yourself, my goodness, do I have to work through all of that? Well, certainly the first answer is no, and even if yes, then not all at once. In fact, I think it would be impossible to work through all of those things in rapid succession. Each takes time, some more time than others. Then bear in mind why I have created this YouTube channel, which I talk about more in my introduction clip. This is my download of what I've worked on for several decades, and I'm far from getting my 100% completion mark on all of this myself. If you're a survivor of male childhood sexual abuse, then know that I'm a fellow survivor walking alongside you. We can help each other. And of course, most of the content on this channel is applicable to female victims also. It's just that I want to specifically help male survivors know and be aware there is a specific resource to help them and cover some male-specific content. So let's start with guilt. I'm not saying you should have it or feel it, but most likely you will feel it. A sense of somehow blaming yourself, blaming the young child that was abused, blaming him or her for what happened and how it may be affecting you now. So here's the first thing you need to know when tackling feelings of guilt. The abuse was not your fault. That is just probably one of the most important things that any survivor of sexual abuse can ever take on board and try and understand. it was not your fault. The abuse typically takes place in secret. Perpetrators often encourage or even threaten their victims not to tell anyone. That creation of secrets can lead to a victim feeling guilty now for two things: the abuse and the secret. Neither warrant the victim or the survivor in feeling guilt, and if you still are struggling with that, I really want to encourage you, please don't take on that guilt any longer. Let go of it, shed it as soon as you possibly can. The guilt never belonged with you, the child victim, and it doesn't belong with you now, the adult survivor. You know, that whole in secret thing, that imprints on a young person's mind. It imprints false shame. Again, shame is something a person feels when they feel regret over something they did. Well, shame has no place in the life of an abused person. The shame related to their abuse, that is. So it's important to realise that shame is often strong and felt strongly in survivors' lives. Equally important is to know that in regards to the abuse, there is no need to feel or own that shame. In fact, it's time to disown that shame if you haven't yet. It's not yours, and it never was. You know, victims often feel a bizarre sense of care from perpetrators. Perpetrators can be very skilled in recognising a child victim may not be experiencing a high level of perceived care. They move on that, and in a distorted way, offer a level of care or what they want to be seen as care. To a child who feels a lack of care, they may see the abuse as some form of care. That's a horrible, evil thing, but you've got to remember that as a child, you know, children don't have all of those filters, and what they're desperately craving for, if they get it in some way, they will be more responsive to that than if they never got it at all. And sadly, perpetrators know that, and they can pick up on it. So that's incredibly confusing for the child, and it's hard to fathom as an adult survivor. Nevertheless, that was a dynamic that was at play at the time. So on the guilt point, it is another instance where we don't need to accept feelings of guilt we felt over that level of supposed care. To round out that point then, it's understandable that there can be confusion about why we thought the abuse was some form of care. And again, that's a process that you will need to work through and give yourself time. Now let's talk about contradictions. Things like, you know, human touch. There's the human touch that we desperately needed as a child, and perhaps that touch may have felt good, but it came with a price. Many abuse victims are in environments where healthy physical touch is lacking, sometimes totally absent. And so it should not be surprising that physical touch that we as human beings are wired for, it shouldn't be surprising that this is something that a child is open to and in fact needs. Sadly, it can be inappropriate human touch that they receive. That's where the contradictions, that touch that appealed to our humanity, it came with an abusive price tag, and so again, more contradictions. You know, in a healthy environment, a child receives messages of acceptance and they receive affection in appropriate ways. When abuse is present, those inner needs are still there, they still find affection, they still need it, but unfortunately it comes in the wrong way and it typically comes through abusive touch. A child, the adult, can feel the guilt that they wanted that touch. They've got to remember it was abusive touch and that's not what they wanted. They needed appropriate touch. So that's just another thing to work through. What can also happen? Survivors of childhood sexual abuse can detach emotionally. That's a side effect for many survivors. The detachment can start during the abuse as a self-defense mechanism or a self-preservation mechanism. Sadly, we get so good at that we can take those levels of emotional detachment into our adult lives, quite often for years or even decades. Then, as if that wasn't enough, we then feel guilt about being that way. There's a saying you may have heard of that is simply not true. It says, time heals all wounds. Well, if that were so, time can simply fester the guilt we may feel for some of those reasons that I've just been talking about. Connected to that is that we can develop a sense of self-disgust, or for many survivors, if you ask them why they feel that way, they may not be able to yet identify why, yet they feel very strongly that way. That's time blurring the details as to the origins of some of those feelings. Many condemn themselves for being needy. That is so sad. Every child has needs. A survivor can think to themselves, if only they were not so needy, then perhaps they would not have been open to being abused. Perhaps their needs were the reason. No, the abuser is the reason for the abuse, not the child victim. Again, you need to hear that. The abuser is the one at fault, not you. Your natural human needs, specifically as a child, were put there by design. You did nothing wrong by having those needs. You know, as adults, many carry the guilt for not stopping the abuse whilst they were children. Childhood abuse happens because there is an imbalance of power between the child and the perpetrator. It's not always about physical size, strength, or age differences. That imbalance is why the abuse happens in the first place, and it's the same reason why the child victim is most often not able to stop it. You know, we can get angry at ourselves for not protecting our younger selves. This is similar to the same thoughts we have about feeling guilty for not stopping it, as if we could. Do you know what though? The fact that you have made it this far means that you have protected yourself enough to survive. That is protecting oneself, the way I look at it. There's no other way. To sexual abuse, of course, its very nature is sexual. So it should be expected, sadly, that it does affect us sexually. Regarding these effects, I'm certainly not qualified to provide professional counsel on that, but I am one who has experienced some of these effects myself, and so at the very least, I want to highlight some key areas of pain, frustration, and confusion that I, along with other survivors, have encountered. I could say from my perspective that my emotional life as a child was one where my feelings were all over the place, suppressed at some times to protect my mind from the regular family abuse I witnessed, and then at other times those feelings went into overload, mostly as a result of the abuse. So, and you know, this is my point here, as I developed as an adult and experienced feelings of a sexual nature, it was hard to separate a normal feeling from a sexual feeling. Both kind of got fused together and they seemed inseparable. If you are a male who was abused by a male or males, you may be able to relate to this. Feelings towards men can elicit confusing feelings. You may question if your feelings are sexual or not. Certainly nobody wants unwanted sexual feelings. If you're a male who was abused by a female, or females, you may also be concerned that feelings you have towards other women may also be sexual, even if that's not your intent. There is perhaps uncertainty or confusion there. Counselling has certainly helped me try to navigate or identify on those situations. Essentially, it can really mess up with your head. It's difficult to separate what are normal feelings towards a male or a female, and then when abusive thoughts and memories come to mind, things that we sometimes refer to as triggers, then the sexual nature of the abuse comes into that situation perhaps sometimes, and you can think, is this a normal feeling I'm having towards this person? Or has this become some sexualized thought? And if it is that what I want to have happen, or has it come unintentionally and without invitation? And then if it has, then that can be upsetting and confusing and frustrating, and you have this real sense of, I don't want these thoughts, but they're here, and that whole cycle just goes around and around. If that's you, if you can relate to that, well, that's because I can as well. And so I'm sorry that that's your experience, but know that it's actually to be expected from childhood sexual abuse survivors. Lastly, on this point, normal platonic feelings for any gender, of course, they can get warped and distorted, and it's for those same reasons. But I encourage you to go through that journey and reclaim some of those more normal feelings. So that has actually been a lot to cover just on this first point of guilt, part of the recovery journey and part of this recovery series. The next message I have on recovery, message number 2, is betrayal. But before I end this message, I wanted to read a Bible verse that has helped me let go of the guilt that was never mine in the first place to have. It's this verse, Romans chapter 8 and verse 1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. You know, that's meaningful for me because when I feel guilt about the abuse I was also experienced, when I feel condemnation from myself, this verse encourages me, even if, you know, I feel like I don't deserve it. I need to accept that God doesn't want me to blame myself, and He doesn't blame me either. I hope that's an encouragement to you also. So thank you for joining me with this content. It's always my intention that this helps you or helps you to help others. In addition to this content, I wanted to let you know that I also have an introduction clip and my personal testimony. I encourage you to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you are notified when additional content is available. Perhaps a little strange on a channel like this is the like button, but I'd ask you to press that if you have found the content helpful. I hope you join me again soon.